we have been journeying through the book of John over the last several weeks, we have taken time to pause and to consider some of the many miraculous signs that Jesus does throughout the first half of this gospel. We've paused to consider moments where Jesus turns triscuits and bait into food for thousands, and moments where he has turned water into wine at weddings. And in all of these miraculous signs, we have listened as Jesus has relentlessly attempted to push his disciples toward understanding something critical about who he is. So as we move into our final week of our series on the book of John, it seems fitting to pause and to consider one last miraculous sign that Jesus does before Passover, before he is turned over to be crucified. And for John, this story that we find our text in today, a story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, contains the ultimate sign that Jesus does to convey exactly who he has been claiming to be, the Son of God. We enter into our biblical text this morning at what I consider to be a pivotal moment in this story. For it is in this moment that all of Jesus' disarming exchanges and dealings with his disciples, with Martha and Mary and Lazarus, come to a serious head. Jesus and his disciples have returned to Bethany, to a town only 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, where Jesus was nearly arrested and stoned by the Jews a few days earlier for proclaiming to be the Son of God. For his disciples, the level of vulnerability and fear that they faced at the prospect of death in Bethany seemed insurmountable. And yet the cost of going to Bethany is juxtaposed with the immediate needs of Lazarus' illness and of the cries for help from 2 women who were about to lose their brother. Jesus quickly becomes entangled in this complex scenario, interwoven with the needs and the fears and the uncertainty and the pain of people counting on him. And his response is not what any of them expected. Instead of rushing to the bedside of Lazarus or healing him from afar as he did in just a few chapters before for a government official seeking healing for his son, Jesus allows the unthinkable to occur. He waits 2 days before responding to the news of Lazarus' illness, and by the time he shows up, he is 4 days too late. Lazarus has died and his sisters are shattered. So broken were the women that when Mary finally makes her way to Jesus in John 11, she falls to her knees weeping, and she musters up the last bit of energy she has left to utter the only thing in that moment that mattered. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Where were you? From the outset, it is clear that every actor in this story had expectations of Jesus, and every one of them had something to lose. The predicament of Lazarus impacted all of them, and it did so in very real and vulnerable ways. For the disciples, they risked everything for Jesus. They gave up their professions, their families, their entire lives to follow a man who spoke in parables and who they only understood about half of the time, if that. These disciples were there in John chapter 10 when the Jews came to Jesus in Jerusalem to ask him who he really was. And they heard Jesus respond to the Jews, telling them that the reason for why they still had no answer to this question was because they didn't make the cut. These Jews were not Jesus' sheep. The disciples watched as these these Jews, upon hearing this news, bent down to pick up stones, intent to kill. And the disciples were the only ones who helped Jesus escape arrest. And so, when Jesus calls the disciples back to this place of threat and danger, the disciples cannot think to do anything but protest. Lord, you said this illness did not lead to death. We love Lazarus too, but we cannot go there. It is too dangerous. Everything that you've worked for, everything we've worked for, will be undone. Aren't you supposed to protect us? Perhaps in the minutes that Jesus and his disciples were first informed of Lazarus' illness, Lazarus was having a few thoughts of his own. Though the story tells us very little about his perspective, imagine with me some of the things that might have been running through his head as he counted the last painful minutes of his life. There is so much I've left undone. Who will protect and take care of my family if I am not here? Will Jesus really leave me here to die? The story shifts to days later in Bethany, and we find two broken women reeling in the wake of their brother's final fate. Perhaps Martha is so overcome by doubts and questions that her mad dash to Jesus is an attempt to get some answers. Lord, if you were here, my brother would not have died, but even now I know that God will give you what you ask. This last-ditch effort for Martha to cling to her faith perhaps suggests that in a time of such unbelievable uncertainty, she really has no idea what to make of her circumstances. Jesus,